All right, we're very pleased today to have Tor Bukkvoll, who is a analyst of defense affairs based in Norway. And Tor is going to talk about his new book that he has published with University of Press of Kansas, which is a analytical history, Spetsnaz, a history of the Soviet and Russian special forces. We're very pleased to have him here. It's a great read, great book, and really interesting and thoughtful. And thank you for all the different people coming on today. Just sort of rules of engagement, if you will. We'll obviously have lots of time for Q&A, commentary, back and forth. Just sort of raise your hands. We'll get to everybody. Alice is going to help me. Frank, I might even make you a co-host so you can help as well. And let's get going. So, Tor, just introduce yourself. And if you have a PowerPoint and you want to share that, please do.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this. I haven't had many of these events so far, so I think this is more or less the first. So I'm very happy you asked me. So my name is Tor Bukkvoll. I work at something called the Defense Research Establishment in Norway, and we are a research institute under the Ministry of Defense, and my job there is to participate with this larger group in making background analysis for Norwegian long-term defense planning. And within that, my responsibility specifically is Russia, and I've also been doing some Ukraine stuff. So that's the background. Let me see if I can share my presentation with you. What I thought I'd do is it kind of summarized the book, but differently from how the book was written. So the structure of the book is largely chronological, and I thought that instead of doing a chronological presentation with this with the slides, I'll go kind of unit by unit. So I'll kind of go through all the units that Russia has, or the ones that are covered in the book and that come under the term of Spetsnaz, and say what has been the most important periods in their development and how they have developed. And then I have a final slide with some lessons which have been called the Soviet and Russian experience from 1950 to 2023. And after that, we can go to questions. So that's kind of the setup for this presentation. Shouldn't take too long. So I'll start though with this quote from Sergei Kozlov, who is the editor of the 5-volume series of Spetsnaz memoirs that you can see in the picture there. And he's also a Soviet-Afghan war veteran, and one of those who have had the most to say and to discuss about soft development, I would say, for the last 20 years on the Russian side. He even commented on Russian soft developments slightly into the current war with Ukraine, but now even Kozlov is silenced. The point here with the quote is that he writes that in actual fact, and to my great regret, Russia never ever truly possessed special operations forces. So in a sense, I'm writing a book about something that Kozlov says in reality didn't exist. But what Kozlov means by this is that while Russia did develop special operations forces and called them that, and these forces themselves have always seen themselves as special operations forces, they were rarely used for that purpose, or the majority of the things they've done over this long period has not really been special operations. And that's kind of the theme that follows on throughout my book. So I'll start with that, and then I'll just go to the different units and different types of special operations forces that Russia has had and still has in this period. And we start in 1950 with the Spetsnaz GRU. So that's GRU is Russian military intelligence. Their land brigades. That was the first special operations forces established by the Soviet Union after the Second World War. And they were established for a very specific purpose. That was to go into Western European countries and destroy the US tactical nuclear weapons that had started to be placed there in the early 1950s. Because the Soviets were very afraid of these nukes, and they didn't really have anything that could hit them from their territory. So they found out the only way was to send forces deep into Europe to try to destroy these weapons. And that was the main job of Spetsnaz from 1950 until almost the 2000s. So it's been their main purpose and the main reason why they were established in the first place. Of course, the big war with NATO never happened. So they have in fact been doing much else, and the operation that they are most famous for is the operation in 1979 to kill the Afghan president as the introduction to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So you see a picture there of the palace that Spetsnaz stormed in that operation. What we can say is that both in Afghanistan, later in Chechnya, and in most other wars where Russia was involved, these forces fought as not as special operations forces, but as light infantry. Basically, they filled in all the roles that the Russian army should have been able to cover themselves, but were not able to do so. Another thing that's important to notice here is that in the beginning they had this US nukes, but also a number of other jobs or assignments as special operations forces, like special reconnaissance, and also for a period killing dissidents in Europe and other places. But they, from the 1960s, there was a significant development in that the land brigades also got a role in what today would probably be called military resistance. That is, in training opposition forces, military opposition forces or insurgencies in other countries. First of all, the idea was that if the big war with the West came, then there would be a lot of sympathy for the Soviet Union among the working classes of the West. And then the Spetsnaz GRU brigades would have a job in training those anti-Western forces within the big war, but forces that were then part of the West, or the people from Western countries. Again, that also something they never did, because that war didn't come. But they have had that role of training other forces in other wars later. So especially in the civil war in Tajikistan from 1992 to 1995, they had a very significant role. They also did work like this earlier, especially in Africa, in Angola, in the 1980s, to some extent also in the Ogaden war between Ethiopia and Somalia, and some other places. And they did do quite a lot of insurgency training for anti-colonial rebels, but in the Soviet Union. So there's a sub-chapter in the book on the Crimean School of Insurgency, because that's also something that the land brigades did in particular. So that, I think, that kind of summarizes the land brigades. And I think when people think about Spetsnaz, it's often these land brigades that they think about. Then secondly, we have what is called in Russian the naval intelligence points. These are small groups of naval special forces. They were established quite soon after the land brigade. So the first were established, or the decision to establish them was taken already in 1952. But the interesting thing here is that whereas the land brigades were created for a very specific strategic need to take out these US tactical nuclear weapons, the naval intelligence, the naval special operations forces, they kind of forced themselves onto the Russian military structure. So there were enthusiasts down in the organization that thought this was a good idea, but the Navy didn't want them. So they had totally different start from the land brigades. It was a bottom-up initiative, you may say, that met a lot of resistance for quite a long time. And I think that resistance kind of just was beaten only when the Soviet Union saw that also other countries established naval special operations forces. And in contrast to many Western naval special operations forces, the naval special operations forces of Russia never kind of went ashore. So they didn't, like the US Navy SEALs, for instance, take part in land operations on any scale. there's a small episode when they did this in the first Chechen War as volunteers, but in the second Chechen War, the Navy basically said, "You're not allowed to do this anymore," because these guys were very costly to train, and they were not trained for that war, so the Navy lost a lot of them in the first Chechen War. I didn't want to have the same experience again in the second war. So that they are still in existence, of course, but they are still small and very connected to the Navy in general. They're much closer to the Navy, you can say, than many naval special operations forces have been in many other countries. Then thirdly, we have the 45th Spetsnaz Regiment of the Airborne Forces, which was established only in 1994, based on a kind of intelligence unit within those forces before. The main point here is that the 45th Spetsnaz Regiment was established at the time when Russia, this was after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when Russia thought that they may have to send their airborne forces on missions outside Russia alone. And before that, it had always been assumed that the airborne forces would fight together with other forces of the Russian or Soviet military. But after 1994, they thought maybe we will have operations in the future where we only send airborne forces, and then they should have more of a special forces capacity developed themselves. So that was the reason why this unit was established. And this is kind of the only special operations forces of Russia that, at that time at least, had something of a strategic role. So they were part of the airborne forces, but they could also, in principle, be used directly by the Russian general staff, if without the rest of the airborne forces, if there were missions for that. So this was the kind of the start of a really strategic capacity in terms of special operations forces. But then after that came the really most important, and still today most important, strategic capacity in terms of special operations forces. That is the SSO or KSSO. I call them SSO because that's the Russian abbreviation. Many tend also to call them KSSO, and where the K stands for command. I think that abbreviation is a little misleading because command in this respect may make you think that this is something like SOCOM in the United States or other overreaching structure that commands several types of special forces, and that's not the case here. The SSO is simply one more Russian special operations force, but much more like the sharper parts of the Western Special Operations Forces. So it was officially established in 2013, but it had been under development since 2009, and it actually came out of an experience in the Second Chechen War where the military leadership found out there were a lot of tasks for which they would like to use special operations forces, but these were just not good enough. So in Second Chechen War, they started to make officer-only units within the Spetsnaz GRU, and these then developed slowly into the SSO. But important here is also that the SSO has a strong influence from the special forces of the KGB, now FSB, which I haven't talked about yet. I'll come back to them. So this is the sharpest end of the Russian special forces today. They were at the helm of the operation to take Crimea, as you see from the picture there, in 2014, and later they have been very active. They were very active in Syria for many years. So they kind of, most of their operational experience actually by today is from Syria, although we know they have been used also now in the present war in Ukraine. And then, so the forces that I have been discussing so far are all under the Ministry of Defense. But there are other special operations forces also in Russia, and I will here talk briefly about Alpha and Wimpel, which are the main special operations forces of the former KGB, now the FSB. So Alpha was established in 1974, and that was at the same time that similar forces were established in many parts of the world, based on the horrible experience that Germany had with the Israeli contingent that was killed during the Olympics in Munich in 1972. So after that, and after everybody saw how the German police failed to deal with these kidnappers, the Palestinian kidnappers, there was a wave of anti-terrorism forces being created in many countries, including in the Soviet Union. So that was the reason for the creation of Alpha. They are still today Russia's main anti-terror force, which also means that these guys are some of the best in terms of close quarter combat. But they're not then trained really for long range missions into enemy territory necessarily. Although also in the Soviet period, they had a special job in terms of breaking into government bunkers in Western countries if there was to be a big war with NATO, just because they were the best at close quarter combat. So there's always been kind of a foreign job for Alpha, in addition to the anti-terror tasks at home. And then finally, Wimpel was established in 1981 by Yuri Drozdov. There's a picture of him here. He had taken part in the storming of the Palace of Amin in Afghanistan in 1979. And after that, he thought that we need something new in the Soviet Union. We need some forces that can fight in and use force also towards the West in a below the threshold of war. So that's why Wimpel was established, and Yuri Andropov, who was the chief first of the KGB and then later party secretary, was instrumental in the creation of Wimpel. But the thing is that Andropov, although he really wanted the Soviet Union to have such a capability, he became more and more reluctant to do that. So they didn't really work in that capacity almost ever. But it was kind of the first hybrid warfare unit of the Soviet Union. So to sum up what I've said here, and these are the kind of the 6 lessons that I think we can draw from this in terms of the Soviet and Russian experience, is that the softness of Russian special operations forces always, and I still think today, is dependent on what I call army health and the system of command. By that I mean that if the army is capable of doing everything it should, especially in terms of both fighting but also intelligence gathering, then there is a possibility for the Russian Special Operations Forces to be exactly that. But because that was never the case, these forces tended to function as gap fillers for army weaknesses in every war that Moscow got involved in. And on top of that, they were all almost always under command of higher officers who had no idea about what to do with them. So that's also a reason why they were used as gap fillers instead of SOF. Another problem of the Special Operations Forces was that they fought a lot in counterinsurgencies, but the idea or the dominating paradigm in Moscow was always major war, probably still is. So after Afghanistan, everything was forgotten in terms of fighting counterinsurgency, and when these forces then had a significant role in the Chechen wars again, there was really no books, no guidelines for how to do counterinsurgency. Basically, Moscow refused always to learn anything about counterinsurgency because it was seen as kind of besides the point. It was not real war. Thirdly, it struck me, one may think that special operations forces or other forces also in a country that is an autocracy, that everything will come from the top. But I think it's striking throughout this book that lobbying and political patronage has been crucial also within those kind of systems for the development of such forces. 4 is what I call that SOF is a poison chalice for authoritarian and unstable regimes. By that I mean that there is a special problems for these regimes to have special operations forces because they're afraid that they will be used in domestic power struggles. The first time we saw this was in 1954 when Marshal Zhukov, the great hero of the Second World War, wanted to create a school for school officer training for special operations forces in Tambov, southeast of Moscow. And he was denied to do this, and then there was a kind of a scandal in the Soviet Politburo because the others in the Politburo thought that Zhukov was doing this in order to use these forces to take over control of the Soviet Union himself. And in the book, there are several other examples also of how the political loyalties of SOF have been important at critical junctures in Soviet and Russian history. Number 5 is, I think there's something that you will find in many countries, that because special operations forces have an elite status, they've always been allowed to pick off the best candidates, the best cadres, as the Soviets would say. That has led to rivalries, and in the Soviet case and also in the Russian case, especially between Spetsnaz and the airborne forces. So that relationship was always troubled. It's still troubled today. It has a lot to do with the fact that since Spetsnaz was not allowed to develop its own officer training, they had to do that at the officer school for the airborne forces, and there were always problems and disagreements on how to do that. And then finally, I just say that it is, of course, different from Western countries, most Western countries, that the special operations forces are part of military intelligence. I think in the Soviet and Russian case, that has been an advantage to them in the sense that they had a leadership at least partly different from the regional commands and from the other parts of, especially of the army. So they had some autonomy from the rest of the military because of this. Although it probably would have been better for them to be directly under the general staff instead of being part of GRU. But that was an advantage. The disadvantage was that being part of military intelligence meant that GRU always consisted of the Spetsnaz and the Agentura. And the Agentura are the officers trained for espionage in other countries. And you always had this problem within the GRU that the Agentura saw themselves as brain, and then they saw the Spetsnaz as muscle, and they looked down on Spetsnaz, and therefore the fate of the special forces was always dependent on who was in charge of GRU and whether that person, who mostly came from the Agentura, also had an interest in special forces or not. And when they didn't, and that happened quite often, then this was a significant problem for the Spetsnaz. So I think that concludes my presentation.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This is really, really interesting. And if we can minimize the presentation, and people, of course, raise their hands. Let me just ask the first question. One of the things you talk about in your book is the issue that you raised about the reaction to Zhukov setting up that training course, where they were afraid that they were creating a possible force that could be used in a coup d'etat. And that problem in your book continues into the early 90s. And I wondered if you could talk about that aspect of this, that they were concerned about a possible force that could be used as a coup d'etat. And certainly in the early 90s, when you're having the problems with Yeltsin and the question of secession, that comes into play.
Yeah, sure, I can do that. So there are a couple of big instances in the early 1990s with this really became a big problem, and not for the military special operations forces, but for Wimpel and Alpha, those who were then first in the KGB, later FSB. This happened both when Yeltsin fought against. It happened both when Yeltsin became kind of the leader again, or when Gorbachev was pushed out of power and Yeltsin became head, and then again when Yeltsin, especially when Yeltsin fought against the parliament in 1993. I'm sure you all remember when they used the tanks against the parliament in Moscow, sorry, against the White House in Moscow, which the parliament is called. So in both cases, both Alpha and Wimple were called on to actually clear parliament buildings of the opposition. And in both cases, they did not want to do this. In the latter case, they didn't stand aside, but they actually solved the crisis more or less on their own, but without this leading to bloodshed. In both cases, bloodshed could have been the result. And in both cases, Alpha and Wimple refused to engage in such an action that could lead to bloodshed. And especially in the second case, when Yeltsin fought the parliament, he had a meeting with the heads or with many of the officers of both Wimple and Alpha, and he asked them, "Are you with me in this struggle?" And they just said nothing, basically, because they understood that it was also not acceptable how the crisis unfolded. So in the end, it could have led to bloodshed. So they went into the parliament themselves, not to attack those who had barricaded themselves in the parliament, but to persuade them to leave. So in both these cases, the actions of Wimple and Alpha led to relatively bloodless. There was some bloodshed, but relatively bloodless endings of those affairs. I just add that this was Alpha survived this quite well, but Wimple, because Wimple had refused to be on the side of Boris Yeltsin, he didn't forget that. So after the crisis was over, he didn't disband Wimple, but he did transfer them from the FSB and to the Ministry of the Interior. So actually, he demoted them from being maybe the sharpest at that time of the Russian special forces to become law enforcement. And this was an extreme humiliation to most of the Wimple operators, and actually almost all of them quit. So it became a totally different force after that.
Okay, and we're talking with Tor Bukkvoll, right? Is that, so I don't picture your last name?
Yeah.
Bukkvoll, okay. And he is the author of a new book, Spetsnaz, by the University Press of Kansas. Go on, Julian. Just unmute.
Yeah, phenomenal talk. Very, very interesting. Of course, I scanned some of the chapters in your book. I have two questions. First is methodological. The old debate from British Field Marshal Slim, which is that special forces are a general waste of time. Did you detect a sort of a bifurcation of the Russian army into, the have-nots and then this elite force? And from what you saw in the case of Spetsnaz, where would you fall on that spectrum of don't have any special forces at all, just have very competent infantry units, light infantry units, versus having sort of this bifurcation in terms of mission? My second question is, where does the Spetsnaz stand now? I mean, we see on Russian Telegram, many of the professional Russian military are very frustrated with how the Kremlin is conducting the war. And so we can speculate that there is a divergence between what the Kremlin wants and what the professional military wants. And where is the Spetsnaz likely to sit if there's a move against the government? Would they protect the government? Or would they side with the military? And one of the items you mentioned was that the Spetsnaz is closely associated with Russian intelligence. And I'm wondering then, where's the GRU? Is it with the Siloviki, or is it more with the mainstream military perception of the incompetent conduct of the war in Ukraine?
Okay, good questions indeed. The first one, I'm not totally familiar with the dilemma that you said, but basically, the person that you referred to says that something that having special operations forces and the army as separate things is good. Others think that it's better to have just very good army forces that can do everything. Is that how I should understand it?
Yes, he was the British general in charge of the British Indian Army when the Japanese were advancing, and he was very publicly hostile to special forces.
Right. Okay. So the thing, in a sense, it's hard to know because since I said they were rarely, if ever, used for these very special missions where you use highly trained but few forces that can achieve strategic effects without a lot of firepower. That would be. We haven't seen many cases of that happening because they were never used for that purpose, or almost never used for that purpose. So had they been used for that purpose, we could have seen better results for the Russian army in the different wars that I talk about. But in a sense, you cannot prove what hasn't happened. So it's hard to use this case as an example there. The thing is that they have obviously functioned more in the second way you talked about, that in that they've been gap fillers for the army and therefore made the army do much better than it otherwise would have done. Especially in Afghanistan, the army did very little because the army was created absolutely for heavy mechanized warfare on the plains of Western Europe, in Germany and so on, and in the Afghan mountains that didn't work. So they never learned, or they really, most of them didn't learn to fight any other way. So that's why I think I mentioned in the book that Spetsnaz did something like 80% of the fighting in Afghanistan. But would it be a good idea not to have special forces? And the thing again is that yes, maybe the way it was done in Afghanistan and other places meant that the army fought better than it otherwise would have done. But again, there could have been this very peculiar, very special operations where you just sent in this small unit that did something incredible. And so again, it's the same problem. You don't know what would have happened if they had functioned as they. I would say though that the worst thing is what you have had here in the sense that you have forces that train as special operations forces, feel themselves as special operations forces, and are not used it. It has led to an incredible frustration for many years in these forces in Russia. So in that sense, if they were going to use them for elite infantry anyway, so maybe it would have been better to just have them as that. Now you give them an identity that they cannot fulfill or live up to. The second question is also very interesting, especially in terms of the rebellion we saw last year with Prigozhin, because the Wagner Group was also, although it became quite independent, it started as a GRU Spetsnaz initiative basically, but then it became much more independent. But I think the GRU always had an ownership. If they felt that Wagner was their child, so to say. So this means, and I don't have the empirical material to claim this fully, but I suspect that the GRU, also because of how they behaved in that conflict, have been throughout this war in Ukraine very skeptical of the rest of the military and how the rest of the military have fought the war. And it is a striking episode. I don't remember when Janusbek Yevkurov, who is by himself a former Special Operations Force general, when he went to Rostov to negotiate with Prigozhin, And Prigozhin says that we don't want Putin, we just want Shoigu and Gerasimov, but we want we really want them removed and maybe do worse also things with them. But and then Yevgurov is there and doesn't know what to say, but Alexeyev, who is number 2 in the GRU, so he's a very important person in the GRU, says just come and get them. You have the second on military intelligence saying to this rebel, just come and take my defense minister and my chief of the general staff. And I mean, it's yeah. What can I say more? I think that should answer your question, actually.
Frank, come on, Frank.
Thank you.
Yes, great talk. My wife and I have got a podcast, the delegateslounge.com, and we interviewed the foreign minister of Norway, Ida, and apparently he's taking over the Arctic Council. Obviously, there is a lot going up in the northern hemisphere there, up in the Arctic, especially with the climate change and the possible sea routes becoming far more important strategically. Can you tell us of evidence of any form of, say, naval intelligence doing things, particularly regarding cables, and also whether or not there is a possible unity with Chinese intelligence organizations? I mean, this would be tough for you to determine. I realize that, but yeah, that's the first question. The second question, obviously, is, I'm sure others are going to ask this: why did they fail so completely in the initial stages of the Ukrainian invasion? But the first one is regarding the Arctic. If you can do that for us, thanks.
So on the Arctic, yes, things are changing. I wouldn't put too much emphasis on China yet. It is something we are obviously monitoring a lot, but we also keep an eye on it in case China becomes more involved together with Russia. So far, I will have to say that Russian military activity in the Arctic, for example, if you look at Russian exercises in the Arctic, naval exercises, they have, after the outbreak of the Big Four in Ukraine, they have actually become less provocative than they used to be. Before that, Russia used to have naval exercises further south, and they also used to have them at the same time as we had NATO exercises in Norway, just to make those exercises more difficult for us to execute. So that, but after Ukraine, they've actually pulled their forces further north and become less provocative in terms of those exercises. On the other hand, there is an increasing hybrid activity, especially in terms of influence operations. But now I'm sure you have seen all that, mostly in the Baltic Sea, the cutting of sea cables. We have a problem in the northernmost county of Finnmark with jamming of GPS signals, which they jam the satellite signals, so that our civilian aviations have problem landing, and then this is really becoming a problem. So we see kind of mixed behavior from Russia in the Arctic, I think, in our close areas, less, as I said, provocative in terms of big naval exercises, but at the same time an increase in this hybrid activity. So in general, I think especially the police in northern Norway now, they're more worried about Russian activities than ever. And part of that is probably done by intelligence. I should mention that I think that's in the book as well, that the GRU, in addition to having the Agentura, that is the spies, the military spies, and the Spetsnaz, there is a third line of work, you may say, in between there, which is sabotage, assassinations, all that kind of stuff. And that was really not very strong for a long time, but it's getting stronger now. It's more organized, and at least some Russian analysts think that the parts of the increasing hybrid activity of the GRU comes from the fact that Spetsnaz has become much stronger in the GRU than they used to be. So it's a kind of overspill of Spetsnaz dominance in the GRU. So that was on the Arctic. Then the second question, why did they fail in Ukraine? Of course, many other people can also answer that one, and probably even better than me. But I think the main thing here is that they made a huge intelligence blunder. We know that for sure. And why did they make this huge intelligence blunder? I think just because partly if the GRU and other Russian intelligence services had told the leadership the truth, and the truth in this case was that the Ukrainians were willing to defend themselves, that they were able to defend themselves because the Russian military had, the Ukrainian military had improved a lot since 2014, and that the West would react to such a Russian intervention. If that had been said by the intelligence to the political leadership, that would not have been welcome information to the political leadership. And it may also be that the narrative truths dominant in Russian political and military circles were so that even the intelligence services didn't really see what everybody else could have seen. When I talk about this give talks about this, I say that if the Kremlin had called me, I could tell them everything about this, because all students of Ukraine, based on open sources, knew that the Ukrainians would fight and knew that the Ukrainian military was better than it was in 2014. But and many in Russia, including people I know, warned the Kremlin that you should not think that a war in Ukraine is going to be an easy fight. But the Kremlin was just not willing to listen to that.
Interesting. Now, one of the things, before I bring you on, Alex, one of the things you talk about in the book is that whole training program in the Crimea for the liberation movements that that Spetsnaz is involved with in GRU, et cetera. And what I'm curious about is your take on this dilemma or question. First of all, when one looks at the history of the Comintern, there is a serious development in the Comintern in terms of its training of military tactics and strategy to be implemented in activating revolution throughout the world in the 20s and 30s. And one, I guess, could argue that disappears with the Stalinist purges of the late 30s. But at the same time, the other question comes in as to the influence of partisan warfare, the experience of the Soviet Union in partisan warfare, World War II. So I'm just curious, before I bring Alex on, and please, others, don't be shy, raise your hands. What is your opinion about that kind of experience in terms of creating a doctrine or implementation of subversive warfare by the part of the Soviet Union?
You mean that something like that could happen today, or are you talking about what happened in the Soviet period?
Well, whether it has an impact or not in the kind of discussion you're talking about in the post-war period after World War II.
Right. So, first of all, I think this came from, you know, that the Soviet leadership more or less disbanded all partisan units in Soviet Union. I think it was in 1938 or something, just because they were afraid that having all these civilians running around with guns, that was a potential risk for the regime. And then there was a re-evaluation of that very thought in the late 1950s, early 1960s, I thought, which then led to this the new job for Spetsnaz GRU in terms of training partisans for warfare in a potential war. And probably the training school in Crimea and other things came as a result of that. Once you had this idea that special operations forces could train other or foreigners in partisan warfare, then maybe not only in case of the big war with NATO, but maybe this could also take place in in the proxy wars that the two superpowers were fighting in different places of the world. What I do seem to remember, and I think I write about this in the book, is that the military leadership were hesitant to do this because there was a lot of fear in that period that doing something like this could escalate to war with NATO, even if it was done in Angola or some other place in Africa. But they did it anyway. But I remember that from the sources I've seen that there was always a big scare within the leadership in the Kremlin that this should come out. Of course, other countries knew, because you can't really hide it when your people are fighting in other parts of the world. But there was always this scare that Soviet not mercenaries, but Soviets fighting in Angola would be taken prisoner, and that there would be major political consequences. So this is, by the way, very different, of course, from today, when the leadership in the Kremlin is not afraid of anything being exposed in terms of what they are willing to do.
Right. Go on, Alex.
Yeah. So I guess the first question, again, thanks for a great talk, is, especially we Americans, we know the whole history of the development of U.S. Special Forces, the Ranger Regiment, the Second World War, then, and the UDT teams, which of course, predecessors of the SEALs, but again, Vietnam when the Special Force A teams and SEALs created, then, the creation of a Delta Force in the late 70s, but and then other countries kind of matching that, the British SAS coming out of Long Range Desert Group, Special Boat Service too, and other Western countries. But I'm interested what relationship there is between is there like a reaction to Soviets and then Russians kind of copying Western Special Forces? And my other question is, what's your understanding of what happened, at Beslan, the famous school, and which unit, kind of botched that, where they, wound up killing a bunch of the hostages too? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll start with Beslan, because I was really that's not covered in the book, but I was going back and forth on whether to include that or not. And in the end, I didn't, mostly, I guess, because I didn't want the book to become too long, and also because that is relatively well covered other places. But of course, Beslan would be the FSB's job. So in sense of who failed, FSB failed. But then it's a little bit like, we have had terrorist incidents in this country too, and who failed? Is it those who were in charge, or is it actually everybody failed because nobody really trained beforehand in how to do things together? So I think that can be discussed in this case also. And therefore, it probably would be wrong to only blame the FSB, but yes, they were definitely. This was a classical thing that they should have been able to handle, and that they were not. It's interesting what you mentioned about copying Western Special Operations Forces, because today nobody would admit that, of course, in the Kremlin or in Russian military. But when the SSO, so this Russian, you may call it the Russian Delta Force, basically. When the SSO was established in 2013, then it was explicitly said that this is a copy of Western Special Operations Forces. And we know that the chief of the general staff at that time, General Makarov, he went both to your country, to Germany, I think he also went to France, maybe into Great Britain, to study Special Operations Force. This is not such a long time ago, but at that time this was still possible. So he went around and studying them, and he became very impressed, especially with the Green Berets. And I have this from sources in Moscow that what impressed him the most was they were so smart. And he hadn't thought about that. There has been a tendency, I think, in the Russian Special Operations Forces to think that the best fighters in Special Operations Forces will be the strongest and the kind of the more macho. But he was really struck by the intellectual capacities he thought he discovered in your Special Operations Forces. So he wanted more brain, so to say, in the Special Operations Forces. That was the idea.
Robert.
Robert's having trouble raising his hand.
So Robert should unmute.
Yeah.
And so, then to Alex. And
Robert, unmute, please.
Sure, I did.
Gotcha.
Well, my question is basically, you care to speculate about this new episode, the communication cable cut to Finland and whatever? I mean, whose fingerprint you think is there? Which of these branches?
Right. So far we don't know, but what I haven't mentioned so far, but it's in the book, is that the Russian Special Operations Forces have some kind of, I don't know what, units that are close to them, but they're not Special Operations Forces, and one of them is GIGU, G-I-G-U, which is on paper a military research unit for deep waters. But it is, and it's not even part under the General Staff, but it is part of the Ministry of Defense, and they have the special submarines that can go very deep, and they have all kinds of equipment for doing this kind of job. So it's entirely possible that they did it, or at least they can do that kind of job if it's too deep. Now, probably in this case with the cables to Finland, they were not that deep, so that could have been done more or less by anybody, I guess. But it would be especially a job either for the naval intelligence points that are connected to here. So that's the Russian Naval Special Operations Forces connected to each fleet, if not GIGU, or possibly also the SSO. The SSO, so what I call the Russian Delta Command, they have developed also their own naval capacity. So they have a training facility now in Crimea where they train on naval operations. So the SSO is not only on land and in the air, so to say, but they have decided to have their own naval capacity kind of in addition to the naval intelligence points.
Alex.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
We got you, man.
All right. Thank you for a great talk. That was very interesting. And I would have two questions. Actually, the first one would be, if you have any clue and you would like to speculate, why did the Spetsnaz units that were sent to kill Zelensky and other members of the Ukrainian high command, why did they fail? Are they different from the Cold War, or was it just down to the Russian command not giving them the proper tasks to do? And the second question would be, I'm not sure if it completely fits, but can you speculate on if there's any possible Spetsnaz activity under the GRU relating to the Havana Syndrome incidents? For example, the stuff we've heard out of Cuba and those areas? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. On the first one, I really don't know. This is not only up to how good Spetsnaz are and what kind of orders they were given and so on. It's also dependent on how good the Ukrainians are in protecting the president. And they may have, so it could be that some of these operations were quite well prepared, but then the Ukrainians were just better at protecting the president. Also, it may be, but I'm speculating here, that Russia was absolutely certain they would have Kiev within a day or two. So maybe they thought that, okay, if we don't kill him the first day, we'll be able to capture him anyway, because we'll have that capital very soon. So it wasn't that much pressure on killing him. This is actually also in the book. There was an article published in the Russian government newspaper Vzhlyad the day after the start of the big invasion of Ukraine, and that article, that obviously written before the invasion started, but it was still published. So the day after the invasion had started, and celebrating the taking of Kiev. Then it's always from the and taking the taking of Kiev, and that this was the most successful special operation of the Russian special operations forces ever. Then towards the very end of that article, somebody probably had added just before publication that there are some small unexpected problems in this operation, but they will soon be over, and then we'll have it. But that didn't happen. On Spetsnaz and Havana syndrome, I think that is not really a Spetsnaz job. I would guess that this is a job for that, what I call kind of the third, not unit, but the third structure within the GRU. So you have, as I said, you have the spies, you have Spetsnaz, and you have those who do wet jobs, and within that they are reorganized now, so it's much better organized than it used to be. There's a lot of this about this in the book, but I think those, if it was GRU, most probably it would have been them who had a role in the Spetsnaz, in the Havana syndrome thing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Alex Karasik has a question. He has a problem with his microphone. His question is, are there any integral electronic warfare capabilities within Russian special forces?
Right. I don't think they do. That's done by the regular forces, the army, and I don't think they have electronic warfare capabilities. I have never seen that. They may have some, but I haven't seen that. So I don't think that's really seen as their job. That's really all I can say to that. I don't think so, but I don't know for sure.
Okay, thank you. Before I bring Michael on, I want to just ask you about the reorganization of the Wagner Group after Prigozhin's attempted coup d'etat. How do you understand that? And also, what thoughts do you have about the operations in sub-Saharan Africa with Spetsnaz, Wagner, GRU? How do we understand that?
Not very well.
Yeah, right. Not very well, right?
So as I said, GRU and Spetsnaz people within the GRU were some of the organizers of Wagner in the beginning, and it was, if you remember back to the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and then the war in Donbass that Russia started soon after. In that war, Wagner was kind of it was a hired force, but still very much like a special operations force. So they fought similarly to what the Spetsnaz GRU would have done. It's kind of a private Spetsnaz GRU early in that war. But then the next job for Wagner after Donbass was Syria. And here suddenly the Russians discovered that the Syrian army is not able to fight, or very badly. So the Russians, when they went into Syria, thought that they would only need to provide air force, and that the Syrians would do everything on the ground. But that turned out to be completely untrue, because the Syrians were not able to do that, and this was a big surprise to the Russians. So suddenly there was a big need for ground forces, Russian ground forces, and but then the Russian army didn't want to send regular soldiers there, because that would be unpopular at home. So there was a need for Russian mass on the ground in Syria that was not really the regular Russian armed forces. And for that reason, Wagner changed completely. So from being a kind of a small elite Spetsnaz type unit, it became a very broad unit and they took in totally different people. So in Donbass, they had those mostly people with special operations background, but now they took in kind of everybody because they needed mass, and that changed the character of Wagner. So this plus the personal relationship between Evgeny Prigozhin and Putin probably led to the Wagner group being more and more independent. And you can say that led up finally after also, I'm going to talk about Africa later, but this led to the rebellion that we saw last year. And that rebellion, of course, it's the biggest shock, I guess, to Putin since he has come to power. So there was the thinking in the Kremlin after this, I'm pretty sure, was that we cannot risk something like this again. So we need to rein in these independent private military companies, Wagner, first of all. At the same time, we have used them in Africa with great success. So we don't want to lose that either. So that's why the Kremlin and in fact the GRU and the Spetsnaz part of GRU probably, it came up with the idea of Redut, which is now it's not the same as Wagner, because the Redut is an umbrella organization under which there are a lot of different Russian PMCs. And then PMCs in the sense that mercenaries, not PMCs in the Western sense of the word, or at least the current Western sense of the word, but mercenaries. Exactly in order to have this capacity to go on with this capacity, especially in Africa, but at the same time not risk another rebellion at home. So that's why now everybody who signs a contract with the Russian private military company now will sign a contract directly with the Russian Minister of Defense. So it's much more controlled. And why are they in Africa? There are a number of reasons, but I think the most important reason, and this is probably partly why Russia established private military companies at all, is that the Russian leadership feels that they have a right to be seen as a great power, especially after the annexation of Crimea. The West and the United States in particular didn't want to recognize them as such, didn't want to talk to them. So the Kremlin thought, we have the right to be seen as a great power by others. They don't. How do we change that? We act as a great power. And acting as a great power means being engaged in military conflicts around the world, according to how the Kremlin sees it. So I think the engagements in Africa are partly just to restore or kind of force Western countries, and in particular the United States, to recognize Russia as a great power. So, but here the point is the identity itself, not necessarily what you can do with the status of great power. Then there are other reasons as well. So Russia wants to have a multipolar world, which means that they would like to, in international fora like the United Nations and so on, they would like to have the African countries on their side. So there are some more, what you may say, instrumental reasons for the PMC activity in Africa as well. But I think the main reason is just restoration of Russian great power identity in terms of forcing others to give that recognition.
We're talking with Tor Bukkvoll, who's the author of Spetsnaz, which is published by the University Press of Kansas. And we have the great pleasure to hear his thoughts about this new book. Michael.
I'm just like to take a step back here. It seems to me, it always seemed to me that the purpose of special forces was to do what the regular military could not do at any given particular time or place. I would have thought that would have been the obvious reason. Silly me, but the idea is that what it seems to. We've seen examples. During the Second World War, there was the Canadian American Special Service Forces. There was, of course, 136 over in Burma. Whether or not these forces were, how effective they were, whether or not they were used properly is another matter. But that was the purpose of forming these units. One could also argue that airborne in its original form was seen as a special force. So it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that all of this comes down to to something that has plagued every country or every military, which is inter-service rivalry, especially concerning personnel and resources. And this is an old problem that has been going on for years. And it seems to me, this seems to be the problem in Russia as well as political interference, etc. But is that the case? That it's simply it's primarily a case of inter-service rivalry for resources and personnel?
I don't think so. I mean, I do write in the book quite a lot about inter-service rivalry, especially between Spetsnaz and the airborne forces. But I don't think that's not the reason why they were established in the first place. For the land force or for the land brigades, it's pretty easy. It was this U.S. Tactical nuclear weapons that needed to be taken out as soon as a big war was likely to happen. So that had. But I recognize what you say in that when I talk to special operations forces people, but also here at home, there on the one side there is this idea that you have them for kind of in any problem that the regular military cannot fix. So if there's a new problem also here where we don't know how should we do, who should do that? They're kind of a default organization for that. So in that actually kind of rhymes with what you said in the beginning, but it doesn't really cover it fully, I think, because there is this thing that, and I think we have seen this throughout military history, maybe, that there are certain operations that very well-trained, very well-selected groups can do with minimum firepower and far behind enemy lines that can sometimes have strategic effects. And that is just something you cannot do with the regular military. So they must train for that, I think. And then in many countries, they will also be used for whatever new things comes up that others could not do. I don't know if this makes sense, but I see a difference there. So I'm kind of partly agreeing with what you said.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Go on, Julian.
No, can we let Aaron go first, please?
Sure, Aaron, please. Aaron.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk and your friend and your great book. I wanted to know, do you have any opinion on the development of Russian Air Force special operations? Because that's a fairly new area in the development in the special operations community. You know, there's a substantial militarization, or let's just say advanced militarization of Air Force special operations that's very different from the traditional role that they used to provide, which was much more of search and recovery of downed pilots. Now it's integrating as JTACs into special operations units to be able to drive air power into the fight. Is there a similar development of a model like that in the Russian CASO or in the Russian special operations community?
I haven't really seen that, not at least not in an organizational form. So of course they do some JTAC missions and stuff like that, but in terms of creating, for example, something called Air Force Special Operations, that I've never seen that. In fact, the problem has been that the Air Force has been extremely reluctant always to have anything to do with the Special Operations Forces, and this it's actually also relatively extensively covered in the book that the Russian Air Force, both in terms of fighter planes, but specifically in terms of helicopters, they were they didn't really want to have anything to do with the special operations forces. Sometimes they did, but it was always a problem in both, especially in Afghanistan and Chechnya. The helicopters didn't want to fly those missions. They weren't trying to fly. You have to fly missions very differently if you fly for special operations forces than for many other jobs, and they didn't want to do that. And there's always also been in the Soviet, both Soviet and Russian military, a fear of losing bigger platforms. So I think it's in the book that helicopter pilots in the 60s and 70s basically would just fly. They were told to ascend to a certain what is that called, level above the earth, or a certain place, and there's altitude. Thank you. Sorry about that. Altitude, and they stay there because that way they wouldn't wreck the helicopters, and that was really not the training they needed for flying around in the mountains in Afghanistan. They got much better at it in Afghanistan because they had to, but they were not trained for this in the beginning, and it kind of disappeared again as soon as Afghanistan was over, and then you had the same problem all over again, actually to a worse extent in Chechnya. So no, I don't think I've seen anything on what you talked about there in terms of Air Force special operations.
Oh, okay. And a quick micro follow-up. How do you feel that lack of integration impacts their ability to conduct operations? Because obviously it takes a big domain out of the fight, which in the West, across the large NATO states, they have substantial integration of Air Force operations, especially through JTACs, through a joint target or joint terminal focus on directing munitions to to targeting.
I think this is a major weakness. There are many weaknesses of the Russian Special Operations Forces characterized in this book, and this is definitely one of them. I actually think now that I should have emphasized that more than what I did. But it's a lack of tradition, and I definitely they would have achieved more if they had moved in this direction. And in a way, it's also strange that they didn't, because especially when the SSO was established, they kind of specifically learned from the West, as I said, and especially from the United States. But again, maybe this is, without me having good sources for that there's a result of some inter-service rivalry here. So it's been difficult to get the Air Force to do these things to the same extent as that has been done in the West, especially in the United States.
Thank you, Aaron. Those are good questions, because it raises questions about how they're taking the lessons of Desert One, which is where, of course, the special operations community felt that was one example where you did have to have integrated Air Force assets to make sure a problem like that doesn't happen. And then also in your book, when you talk about how they were reacting to the use of helicopters in Afghanistan, it raises questions about what lessons they were learning from our use of air mobile tactics during the Vietnam War. David Isby, David, you haven't said anything yet. Do you want to comment on any of this stuff, David?
Well, thank you very much. Certainly I will buy your look for your book. And I think the bottom line is, yes, they are not perhaps special operations. You have to, in a Western context, perhaps is limited in Afghanistan. But in my experience in Afghanistan, I was focused mainly, for example, on the 66th and 70th brigades, which were VDV units, but were carrying out operations and tactics which were not within the capabilities of most of the motorized rifle formations. Although they themselves had battalions and subunits within them that had received additional training in theater and wore the striped T-shirt, which was very important. And there were other improvised units which within the Soviet order of battle. One thing you don't unit, which was not, don't know if it would count as Spetsnaz, was the VDV's penal battalion. He was in Baraki Barak in Logar province in 1985. And one perhaps advantage they had is, unlike all the other VDV troops, because they were in a penal battalion, they didn't go home at the end of a year's tour of duty. So Afghans who encountered them said they would certainly basically kill everyone they ran into, civilians or resistance. But I certainly will look for that and look for the how this relates to the Afghan experience.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just respond a little bit?
Sure,
it's
please.
It's a good comment. And I'm not covering the VDV in Afghanistan too much, but it's definitely true that as David said, that they were important for fighting the insurgency as well, because they were also able to do things that regular army could not do. Actually, the Spetsnaz, at least at some instances, were set to train VDV units in counterinsurgency, which Spetsnaz themselves thought a little bit ridiculous, I think, because they hadn't trained, they didn't know that too much. They were trying to figure it out themselves, and then suddenly they were put in a position to train somebody in the same thing that they really hadn't figured out yet. And there were, the VDV was not totally happy with how Spetsnaz fought in Afghanistan. At least I have one source that says that the VDV would never have done it like the Spetsnaz did, and they are very there is no discipline there, and they have too high acceptance of losses and so on. So there probably was a bit of institutional rivalry there as well. Just
it's too bad we don't have David Glantz here, because I invited David because he, of course, would be very interesting to comment on all this stuff, particularly when we're talking about the Soviet airborne forces. Julian, go on.
Yeah, sorry, my second volley of questions. It's a soft sociological question. I mean, I've just give a bit of my background. Of course, I've trained Canadian soldiers that have gone into special forces, both academically and in the military. I've published on the Special Service Group in Pakistan. I've met those individuals, and I've spoken to individuals that were operating with it and the Frontier Corps against the Soviets in Afghanistan. I gave an 8-hour briefing to the SEALs in Coronado Island way back when, and I was shocked, frankly, at how intelligent they were. And so this raises the issue. You mentioned that the Spetsnaz employs smart people. I mean, so the question is, how do they see themselves? Is Special Forces in Russia a country with very low trust levels? So it's very different from the U.S. In the U.S., it's very easy to get patriotic Special Forces people, football players to join elite units. And then, a lot of these do come back cynical, because the Americans, they go out to the outside world, and you see them on YouTube. It's a very difficult life to be in the Special Forces in the U.S. But U.S. Special Forces is definitely different from Pakistan or Canada in terms of their culture. Russia has low trust levels. So do Spetsnaz in Russia, do they see themselves as Cossacks? Do they see themselves as protectors of the Kremlin? Are they, Pukajev's peasants revolting on behalf of popular justice? Who are these people? What do they think their role is in Russian society?
Thank you. I'm just writing this down so I remember what you asked. First of all, I think we need, if you look at the whole history of Spetsnaz and especially the land brigades, they were set up with conscripts for most of their history, which has an effect of all conscription service shifted between 2 and 3 years, but it's still not the time that you can build an identity similar to what Western Special Forces if you're in there for, I don't know, 10, 15 or more years. So that I think that's a difference. I think no, they didn't see themselves as Cossacks. I think, especially in Ukraine, they loaded the Cossacks because Cossacks were bottom-up forces in a sense, and Spetsnaz wanted to see themselves as the best representatives of the Russian state. I think they saw. If you ask me, how do they see themselves, and that's what you asked. I think they saw and see themselves as defenders of the state. They have a very strong identity, and you can see that in the book, for example, especially concerning the civil war in Tajikistan. And also, there's an episode in the book where I describe how the special forces, more or less on their own initiative, or with some, but with some military leaders also deciding with them that they should take the tactical nuclear weapons from Kazakhstan and bring them back to Russia. This was not decided by the Kremlin. It was decided by military officers, and Spetsnaz were used for that. And all these things, also how they basically made political decisions in the civil war in Tajikistan, either because no policy came from Moscow, or because they disagreed in the policy initiatives that came from Moscow. So they decided on their own because they thought that in this particular case, the stupid politicians in Moscow are wrong in terms of what's best for the Russian state. So in this case, we'll decide because we know better. We are on the ground and we know better. So I think that would be the main thing in how they see themselves. And then, because they were so much more secret than Western special forces always, they were not really, nobody knew about them in society to any extent, more or less throughout the Soviet period. So I have from people I know in Moscow who said that this, in the West, they became a thing after the Suvorov book. So that's a long time ago. In the Spetsnaz cult in Russia is really something that only happened in the late 1990s and into the 2000s. So now they are seen as elite also by society in Russia, but that was not the case before, just because so few knew about them.
So if I may just do one follow-up, one of my teaching assistants 20 years ago was a Ukrainian GRU who had the same mission as Spetsnaz, but he was in a recon unit in Czechoslovakia, motor rifle division recon unit. His mission, he told me, was to blow up headquarters and chase down nuclear weapons. So I'm wondering, there must be some Spetsnaz who are Ukrainian.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. So
I'm just wondering if they're different, or their cultures evolved away from. Okay, so they can't be obviously they can't be for the state because they know that legitimacy is damaged. They must be protecting something else.
So if there probably still are ethnic Ukrainians in Russian special forces, I would guess there are. I mean, there are many Ukrainians or people with Ukrainian relatives or Ukrainian names and so on. The identities here are very floating. So it's not like if you're called something that ends on enko, that you are a Ukrainian nationalist. There are many Russian nationalists who have Ukrainian surnames and so on. So those Ukrainians who are still part of the Russian special forces, I'm pretty sure they will see themselves as defenders of the Russian state. If they were not, they would have moved to Ukraine. So Ukraine took over two probably of the brigades when the Soviet Union broke up. So the current Ukrainian special operations forces come from the same tradition, but then they have been trained by Western special operations forces for a long time. So they're probably changed. They're quite different now from what they used to be in Soviet times.
Oh, thank you very much.
Right, and Johannes, Ulysses, Bruce, Nasser, Hal, Ivan, please, or Tom, just join in because I want to have other people, of course, have a chance to ask Tor some questions. Go on, Alex.
Yeah, and I'll echo that. Yeah, especially in this year, I'd be interested. But I want to ask Tor you a question about kind of Spetsnaz in Russian popular culture?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alex.
Because obviously, there's a whole huge role of special forces movies here in the U.S., but special forces memoirs and even fiction. I mean, even kind of the Chinese have done that a little bit again. They have their Wolf Warrior series, which essentially is I don't know what the Chinese equivalent to Spetsnaz, but basically that, and they're fighting Americans sometimes. She's an American mercenary, but again, there's that movies. I'm really interested if you looked into that at all. But also, I can think of growing up in the U.S. I can remember in like the '90s, this whole Richard Marcinko, he's the officer. I'm sure many of you guys remember, who founded SEAL Team 6. And then he did this whole series, the Rogue Warrior, a fictional version of himself, doing all these special, crazy special operations, because that was his, reputation as a Navy SEAL. But again, that was very popular. I remember it kind of went on but again, there are other series like that. So again, obviously, American special forces, and the Brits do this too. There's a role in like the popular culture and in movies and books, fiction, and so on. So I just wonder what if you know anything about Russian popular culture and how Spetsnaz is portrayed there.
Well, let me add to that, Alex, and that is because that's a great question. I was going to ask you that question. We have on television right now this TV series Lioness, which is I think on Paramount, and it's essentially directed to the Chinese. The ultimate enemy is the Chinese. And if you start with the Rambo series, with Rambo being a part Apache, part German, Medal of Honor, Green Beret from Vietnam, who is, sort of fits the stereotypes of the crazy Vietnam veteran going bananas. And all throughout popular culture globally, it's sort of a trans Achilles kind of image around the world. And I'm just wondering what you think of that, along with what Alex has said.
I don't have strong opinions on it. I would say I recognize what you're both asking. It's different. There are some similarities and some differences, I think. So the similarity is that now there is a Spetsnaz existence in popular culture, maybe more in books, but also especially during the latter part of the Putin period, in films and TV series. But before that, mostly in books. So, of course, the tradition is not as long, probably, as it was in your country and in other Western countries, just because these forces were secret for so long. So that I think that's a difference. And another difference, I think, is you mentioned this Marcinko who established SEAL and then made some kind of popular culture version of himself. I don't think that would happen in Russia. I think those who have been in special operations forces would not be allowed to do something like that. They would probably also not seek to do it themselves. They would see much more of a difference. Again, I guess this goes back to the previous question about how do they see themselves, and they see themselves much more as actors of the state, often also secret actors of the state. And I would be surprised if somebody from the founders or important people in the Russian Special Operations Forces did that. I should add here, and this is not on popular culture, but a little bit back to the previous question, that there are among ex-Spetsnaz also those who are very much against the Kremlin, especially a guy called Kvatchkov, who was very important in Spetsnaz in the 1990s and into the 2000s, and he was even in 2008 given an assignment to write new doctrine for Spetsnaz in Russia, Vladimir Kvatchkov. But then his suggestions were not accepted, and he became angry and felt betrayed. And now he's anti-Putin and has been twice in prison. The second time for an attempt to overthrow the state, which is probably quite an exaggeration. But from what I've heard, he still has a standing in the Spetsnaz community. So there will be some parts of the Spetsnaz community that they still see themselves as, first of all, as defenders and representatives of the state, but they just happen to think that the current leadership is doing a bad job at defending the state, so there should be somebody else at the helm. So they are not really in opposition as such, but because they hold this view, I'm pretty sure that the Kremlin is keeping a keen eye on them.
Fascinating, because it raises the question of Igor Gorkin, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, Frank, go on, Frank.
Yeah, wouldn't it be true to say that there's been a tremendous loss of face for Spetsnaz, because the initial invasion was essentially covert, similar to the Crimean one in 2014. So what's happened is there's been a major transition to a realization that how you win wars is what happened in Bakhmut. Bakhmut started, as you mentioned, that they were essentially a Spetsnaz, highly professional, and then they, through Prigozhin, changed their modus operandi to accepting casualties on a large scale. And the model is no longer, if there was a model of the Western style, you know, when you put a special forces team in and you need an aircraft carrier to extract them, that's expensive. Whereas they're winning on the battlefield with attrition. So I think the idea of covert operations being essential has changed fundamentally from their point of view. And if we look at the North Koreans that have come over, apparently they were special forces too. So there's seems to be the idea that you're not special, that you're in fact as capable of being gun fodder as anybody else. So I don't know if they've lost a certain amount of prestige. And that's I would argue is the difference between the West and their outlook on what how forces like that should be used. Would that be correct to say?
You're onto something important there. Though I don't think that's how they themselves would see it still, of course. But and they would also think that, yes, this is what happened, but it's not our fault, because again, the stupid army generals don't know how to use us, and they use us wrong. So I think what happened after 24th of February was that when it became clear to the Kremlin and to the general staff that this was going very different from what everybody had expected, that there was panic. I'm pretty sure there was panic in the Kremlin and in the general staff, because the war is turning in a totally different direction, and we hadn't prepared for this, and we don't have the troops, so we just have to grab whatever is available now and put it into the fight, and we don't have time to plan special operations for weeks and even months ahead. We just need these forces, these people need to be fighting on the ground now, otherwise we'll lose even more. And that's how that led to the misuse of Spetsnaz to an extreme degree. I mean, also forces from the SSO seem to have fought as elite infantry, and it's with all their training and selection and everything, it's really bad economics to have them fight as regular troops among other army groups. But I think you're right that the prestige and the kind of fame they got after Crimea has gone because of this war. So in that sense, you're right. But now that the way Russia is fighting the war now, which is to say that that's how you took Bakhmut, I also think that in the Russian context, they see that this is not the way we would have liked to fight the war. This is the way we have to fight the war now because we started the war wrong, and now all the well-trained people are gone, more or less. So there is no choice now. Now we have to fight with people who have had a couple of weeks training, and they, when you do that, you have to fight very differently from if you have people with both much more training and also combat experience.
Thank you, Frank, and Ivan or Hal, if you guys want to add any comments. One thing that's been raised by this with Frank's question with the KPA is that I think many years ago, when back in the 80s, Joe Bermudez wrote his book on the North Korean Special Forces, and it was sort of an eye opener in the sense that they had a different force structure. They conceived of a force structure that would project itself out into the Pacific to attack us on Guam and Japan, throughout the entire strategic theater of operations if a war broke out. So now they're talking about and I don't think anybody's really identified these Korean troops yet, but that some are arguing they come from the 11th Corps, which is their, quote, corps that's organized to do these kind of operations in Korea if a war broke out with the South Koreans. And so that raises questions about the interesting questions of the integration or interoperability issues of new alliances that occur between the Russians and the North Koreans, which I don't know the answer to. But Michael, go on, Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back for a second to the idea of intellectual capacity of special forces. When they select people, now, because you mentioned that the Russian, or alluded to the fact at least, that the Russians may see their special forces in terms of brute force more than intellectual capacity. When they select people for special force, for any type of special forces, is there any type of gradation of intellect? In other words, any analysis of the intellectual capacities of the recruits? Any tests given? Is that, to what degree is that taken into consideration, especially those forces that would be connected with the GRU or the FSB?
Yeah, I don't know much it's a very good question. I don't know very many details on that. It has been, there have been, or there probably still are, demands for language skills at least. So you can probably count that as one type of intellectual capacity. Although from what I've seen in the sources, that also kind of deteriorated for quite a long time. Then there seems to have been, at least in Soviet times, and probably still is, some kind of division of labor here. So the the military special forces, especially the land brigades and probably also the naval intelligence points, they were seen as fighters first of all, and then there's been, versus the main intellectual part of special operations forces, at least until the early 90s, were the Wimpel forces of the KGB. Now, as I said, because they didn't support Yeltsin in trying to take down the parliament, they were transferred for a period to law enforcement. Then they came back again under FSB, and has been under FSB for a long time now. And they may be kind of moving up the ladder again, also in terms of being an intellectual force. But the details on how much there is a focus on that, all I can say is I know that there are demands for some kind of higher education if you're going to be a special operations force. At least there used to be demands for some kind of higher education before you join the special forces, but I don't know many more details than that. Sorry.
All right. Well, on that note, because obviously we could pick Tor's brain for hours here, but it's late in Norway, it's late in Oslo, and we of course could do this another time, and people are encouraged to read his new book, Tor Bukkvoll's book Spetsnaz. It's published by the University Press of Kansas. But does anybody who hasn't asked a question or comment wants to jump in before we close out tonight? Anybody who hasn't asked a question? All right, I can see that everybody is Spetsnazed out, so to speak. All right, well, listen, Tor, it was a great pleasure to have you join us today. And we look forward to hearing you again. You're going to be here in the United States in a while?
I'm going to have a book launch at NPS in Monterey in, I think that's on the 10th of February. I wrote half the book during a sabbatical year in Monterey. So, and probably we're also going to Tampa to have a book launch there afterwards. So yes, I'll be in the United States in not such a long time.
Are you going to come through New York at all?
I don't think New York is on the list. Sorry, no.
All right. Well, maybe we'll suggest your name to some people here in New York City, so maybe they can throw some resources your way. But anyway, listen, thank you so much. It was great to hear you talk about this. I'm sure we all enjoyed it.
I'm very happy that you invited me, and the questions have been fantastic in many ways. I'm now thinking if I had those questions before I wrote the book, it could become even a better book, but that's how it is.
Well, anyway, you're thank you so much. It was a very kind comment to make, and we learned a hell of a lot from you today. Thank you.